In 1946, Immanuel Velikovsky wrote a short book, or a publication, and he titled it Cosmos Without Gravitation: Attraction, Repulsion, and Electromagnetic Circumduction in the Solar System. That was the whole title. A synopsis by Immanuel Velikovsky. I thought it might be interesting for us to go over some of the things that he writes about in 1946. It'd be interesting to compare them to what we know today and see if what he's saying is all that unrealistic. The contents are: number one, phenomena not in accord with the theory of gravitation. 2. Attraction between two atoms, inertia, attraction of bodies toward the Earth, the time of descent and of ascent, a pendulum, the effect of charge on the weight of a body. 3. Attraction, repulsion, and electromagnetic circumduction in the solar system. And 4. The anomaly of Mercury and other phenomena explained. Number 1. The fundamental theory of this paper is gravitation and an electromagnetic phenomenon. Gravitation is an electromagnetic phenomenon. There is no primary motion inherent in planets and satellites. Electric attraction, repulsion, and electromagnetic circumduction govern their movement. The moon does not fall attracted to the Earth from an assumed inertial motion along a straight line, nor is the phenomenon of objects falling in the terrestrial atmosphere.
Comparable with the falling effect in the movement of the moon, a conjecture which is the basic element of the Newtonian theory of gravitation. Aside from several important facts discovered in the study of cosmic upheavals, which are not illuminated here and only enumerated at the end of this paper, and which are discussed at length in a work of research entitled Worlds in Collision, now being prepared for publication, the following facts are incompatible with the theory of gravitation. Number 1. The ingredients of the air. Oxygen, nitrogen, argon, and other gases, though not in a compound but in a mixture, are found in equal proportions at various levels of the atmosphere, despite great differences in specific weights. The explanation accepted in science is this: swift winds keep the gases thoroughly mixed so that, except for water vapor, the composition of the atmosphere is the same throughout the troposphere, to a high degree of approximation. This explanation cannot be true. If it were true, then the moment the wind subsides, the nitrogen in accordance with its gravity or specific weight. But nothing of the kind happens. When some aviators expressed the belief that pockets of noxious gas are in the air, the scientist replied, "There are no pockets of noxious gas. No single gas and no other likely mixture of gases has, at ordinary temperatures and pressures, the same density as atmospheric air. Therefore, a pocket of foreign gas in that atmosphere would almost certainly either bob up like a balloon or sink like a stone in water. Why then do not the atmospheric gases separate and stay apart in accordance with specific gravities?" 2. Ozone, though heavier than oxygen, is absent in the lower layers of the atmosphere, is present in the upper layers, and is not subject to the mixing effect of the wind. The presence of ozone in the atmosphere suggests that oxygen must be still higher. As oxygen is less dense than ozone, it will tend to rise to even greater heights. Nowhere is it asked why ozone does not descend of its own weight, or at least why it is not mixed by the wind with other gases. 3. Water, though 800 times heavier than air, is held in droplets by the millions of tons miles above the ground. Clouds and mist are composed of droplets which defy gravitation. I've often wondered about that. 4. Even if perfect, elasticity is a quality of the molecules of all gases. The motion of the molecules is affected by a mechanical cause, must subside because of the gravitational attraction between the particles, and also because of the gravitational pull of the Earth. There should also be a loss of momentum as the result of the transformation of a part of the energy of motion into vibration of molecules hit in the collisions. But since the molecules of a gas at a consistent temperature, or in a perfect insulator, do not stop moving, it is obvious that a force generated in collisions drives them. The molecules of gases try to escape one another. Repulsion between the particles of gases and vapors counteracts the attraction. 5. The weight of the atmosphere is constantly changing, as the changing barometric pressure indicates. Low pressure areas are not necessarily encircled by high-pressure belts. The semi-diurnal changes in barometric pressure are not explainable by the mechanistic principles of gravitation and the heat effect of solar radiation. The cause of these variations is unknown. Did you notice there's a lot that science doesn't know? It has been known now for 2.5 centuries that there are more or less daily variations in the height of the barometer, culminating in 2 maxima and 2 minima during the course of 24 hours. Since Dr. Beale's discovery in 1664, the same observation has been made and puzzled over at every station at which pressure records were kept and studied, but without success in finding for it the complete physical explanation. In speaking of the diurnal and semi-diurnal variations of the barometer, Lord Rayleigh says, the relative magnitude of the latter semi-diurnal variations, as observed at most parts of the Earth's surface, is still a mystery, all the attempted explanation being illusory. One maximum is at 10 a.m., the other at 10 p.m. The 2 minima are at 4 a.m. and 4 p.m. The heating effect of the sun can explain neither the time when the maxima appear nor the time when the minima of these semi-diurnal variations. If the pressure becomes lower without the air becoming lighter through a lateral expansion due to heat, this must mean that the same mass of air gravitates with changing force at different hours. The lowest pressure is near the equator, in the belt of the doldrums, yet the troposphere is highest at the equator, being on the average about 18 kilometers high there. It is lower in moderate latitudes, and only 6 kilometers high above the ground at the poles. 6. Laplace, pondering the shape of the atmospheric envelope of the Earth, came to the conclusion that the atmosphere, which rotates with the same angular velocity as the Earth, and which behaves like a fluid, must be lenticular in form. Its polar and equatorial axes must be about 35,000 and 52,000 miles, respectively. At the equator, the atmosphere must extend more than 21,000 miles above the ground. At these distances from the ground, the gravitational force of the Earth is just equal to the centrifugal force due to rotation. From the measurement of the pressure of the Earth's atmosphere, measurement based also on the principles of gravitation, it has been deduced that the atmosphere is about 17, not 21,000 miles high. Observations of the flight of meteorites and of the polar auroras lead to the conjecture that the atmosphere reaches to a height of 130 miles. Meteorites, or over 400 miles, polar auroras. Radio measurements yield about 200 miles for the upper layer, recognizable through this method of investigation. 2 computations, both based on the principle of gravitation, differ in the proportion of 17 and 21,000. Direct observations do not justify either of the computed figures. 7. Cyclones. Characterized by low pressure and by winds blowing toward their centers, move counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern hemisphere. This movement of air currents in cyclonic vortices is generally explained as the effect of the Earth's rotation. Anticyclones, characterized by high pressure and by winds blowing from their centers, move clockwise in the northern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. The movement of the anticyclones has not been explained and is regarded as enigmatic. Cyclones and anticyclones are considered a problem of fluidal motion with highest or lowest pressure in the center. As the movement of anticyclones cannot be explained by the mechanistic principles of gravitation and rotation, it must be concluded that the rotation of cyclones is also unexplained. 8. The area of land in the northern hemisphere of the Earth is to the area of land in the southern hemisphere as 3 is to 1. The mean weight of the land is 2 3/4 times heavier than that of water. Assuming the depth of the seas in both hemispheres to be equal, the northern hemisphere up to sea level is heavier than the southern hemisphere, if judged by sea and land distribution. The Earth masses above sea level are additional heavy loads, but this unequal distribution of masses does not affect the position of the Earth, as it does not place the northern hemisphere with its face to the sun a dead force, like gravitation, could not keep the unequally loaded Earth in equilibrium. Also, the seasonal distribution of ice and snow, shifting in a distillation process from one hemisphere to the other, should interfere with the equilibrium of the Earth, but fails to do so. 9. Mountainous masses do not exert the gravitational pull expected by the theory of gravitation. The influence of the largest mass on the Earth, the Himalaya, was carefully investigated with plumb line on the Indian side. The plumb line is not deflected as calculated in advance. The attraction of the mountain ground, thus computed on the theory of gravitation, is considerably greater than is necessary to explain the anomalies observed. This singular conclusion, I confess at first, surprised me very much. G.B. Airy. Out of this embarrassment grew the idea of isostasy. This hypothesis explains the lack of gravitational pull by the mountains in the following way. The interior of the globe is supposed to be fluid, and the crust is supposed to float on it. The inner fluid or magma is heavier or denser. The crust is lighter. Where there is a mountainous elevation, there must also be a perturbance beneath the mountains. This immersed perturbance being of lesser mass than the magma of equal volume. The way seismic waves travel, and computations of the elasticity of the interior of the Earth, force the conclusion that the Earth must be as rigid as steel. But if the Earth is solid for only 2,000 miles from the surface, the crust must be more rigid than steel. These conclusions are not reconcilable with the principle of isostasy, which presupposes a fluid magma less than 60 miles below the surface of the Earth. There remains a contradiction between isostasy and geophysical data. (10) Over the oceans, the gravitational pull is greater than over the continents, though according to the theory of gravitation the reverse should be true. The hypothesis of isostasy also is unable to explain this phenomenon. The gravitational pull drops at the coastline of the continents. Furthermore, the distribution of gravitation in the sea often has the peculiarity of being stronger where the water is deeper. In the whole Gulf and Caribbean region, the generalization seems to hold that the deeper the water, the more strongly positive the anomalies. As far as observations could establish, the sea tides do not influence the plumb line, which is contrary to what is expected. Observations on reservoirs of water, where the mass of water could be increased and decreased, gave none of the results anticipated on the basis of the theory of gravitation. Remember, like I told you before, they have not made one correct prediction. It's amazing. 11. The atmospheric pressure of the Sun. Instead of being 27.47 times greater than the atmospheric pressure of the Earth, as expected because of the gravitational pull of the large solar mass, is much smaller. The pressure there varies according to the layers of the atmosphere from 1/10 to 1,000th of the barometric pressure on the Earth. At the base of the reversing layer, the pressure is 0.005 of the atmospheric pressure at sea level on the Earth. In the sunspots, the pressure drops to 1/10,000th of the pressure of the Earth. I wonder how they can measure that. The pressure of light is sometimes referred to as to explain the low atmospheric pressure on the Sun. At the surface of the Sun, the pressure of light must be 2.75 milligrams per square centimeter. A cubic centimeter of 1 gram weight at the surface of the Earth would weigh 27.47 grams at the surface of the Sun. Thus, the attraction by the solar mass is 10,000 times greater than the repulsion of the solar light. Recourse is taken to the supposition that if the pull and pressure are calculated for very small masses, the pressure exceeds the pull, one acting in proportion to the surface, the other in proportion to the volume. But if this is so, why is the lowest pressure of the solar atmosphere observed over the sunspots where the light pressure is least? 12. Because of its swift rotation, the gaseous Sun should have the latitudinal axis greater than the longitudinal, but it does not have it. The Sun is 1,000,000 times larger than the Earth, and its day is but 26 times longer than the terrestrial day. The swiftness of its rotation at its equator is over 125 kilometers per minute. At the poles, the velocity approaches zero. Yet, solar disk is not oval but round. The majority of observers even find a small excess in the longitudinal axis of the Sun. The planets act in the same manner as the rotation of the Sun, imposing a latitudinal pull on the luminary. Gravitation that acts in all directions equally leaves unexplained the spherical shape of the Sun. As we saw in the preceding section, the gases of the solar atmosphere are not under a strong pressure, but under a very weak one. Therefore, the computation according to which the ellipsoidity of the Sun that is lacking should be slight is not correct either. Since the gases are under a very low gravitational pressure, the centrifugal force of rotation must have formed quite a flat Sun. Near the polar regions of the Sun, streamers of the corona are observed, which prolong still more the axial length of the Sun. 13. If planets and satellites were once molten masses, as cosmological theories assume, they would not have been able to obtain a spherical form, especially those which do not rotate, as Mercury or the Moon, with respect to its primary. 14. The harmonic law of Kepler views the movements of the planets as depending only on their distance from the Sun. According to Newton, the masses of the Sun and the planets must also enter the formulas. The Newtonian orbits differ from the Keplerian found empirically. The Newtonian formula has a sum of masses instead of a product of masses, and in view of the largeness of the Sun, the Newtonian orbits are supposed to not deviate substantially from the Keplerian. 15. Perturbations of planets, due to their reciprocal action, are pronounced in repulsion as well as attraction. A perturbation displacing a planet or a satellite by a few seconds of arc must direct it from its orbit. It is assumed that the orbits of all planets and satellites did not change because of perturbations. A regulating force emanating from the primary appears to act. In the gravitational system, there is no place left for such regulating forces. 16. The perturbating activity appears unstable in the major planets, Jupiter and Saturn, between the minimum of the year 1898 to 99 and the maximum of the 1916-17. There was found an 18% difference. As these planets did not increase in mass in the meantime, this change is not understandable from the point of view of the theory of gravitation, which includes the principle of the immutable gravitational constant.
I know what you're thinking, punk.
17. The pressure of light emanating from the Sun should slowly change the orbits of the satellites, pushing them more than the primaries, and acting constantly. This pressure should have the effect of acceleration. The pressure of light per unit of mass is greater in relation to the satellites than in relation to their primaries, but this change fails to materialize. A regulating force seems to overcome this unequal light pressure on primaries and secondaries. 18. The Sun moves in a space at a velocity of about 20 kilometers a second in relation to the nearby stars. This motion, according to Lodge, must change the eccentricities of some of the planetary orbits to an extent which far exceeds the observed values. 19. The motion of the perihelia of Mercury and Mars and of the nodes of Venus differ from what is computed with the help of the Newtonian law of gravitation. Einstein showed how his theory can account for the anomaly of Mercury. However, the smaller irregularities in the movements of Venus and Mars cannot be accounted for by Einstein's formulas. 20. Unaccounted for fluctuations in the lunar mean motion were calculated from the records of lunar eclipses of many centuries and from modern observations. These fluctuations were studied by S. Newcomb, who wrote, "I regard these fluctuations as the most enigmatic phenomenon presented by the celestial motions, being so difficult to account for by the action of any known causes, that we cannot but suspect them to arise from the action in nature hitherto unknown. They are not explainable by the forces of gravitation which emanate from the Sun and the planets." 21. It was found that the strength of radio reception was nearly doubled with the passing of the Moon from overhead to underneath the observer. It does not appear reasonable that the relatively small gravitational tide in the Earth's atmosphere which changes the barometric pressure by less than half of 1%, could account for a sufficient change in altitude of the ionized layer to produce such marked changes in the intensity of reception. The lifting of the ionosphere generally results in better radio reception, and the small tidal action by the moon when overhead should improve reception a little, not impair it. In any event, the moon cannot have a marked effect on the ionosphere without being itself a charged body. But if the moon is charged, it cannot behave in its motion as though the gravitational force alone acts between it and the Earth. 22. The tails of comets do not obey the principle of gravitation and are repelled by the sun. There is, beyond question, some profound secret and mystery of nature concerned in the phenomena of their tails. Enormous sweep which the tail, makes round the sun in perihelion, in the manner of a straight and rigid rod, is in defiance of the law of gravitation, nay, even of the recorded laws of motion. J. Herschel. What has puzzled astronomers since the time of Newton is the fact that while all other bodies in the sidereal universe, as far as we are aware, obey the law of gravitation, comets' tails are clearly subject to some strong repulsive force, which drives the matter composing them away from the sun with enormously high velocities. W. H. Pickering. 23. The change in the angular velocity of comets, especially of the comet Inca, is not in accord with the theoretical computations based on the theory of gravitation. 24. Meteors, after entering the terrestrial atmosphere at about 200 kilometers above the ground, are violently displaced toward the east. These displacements of the meteors are usually ascribed to winds blowing in the upper atmosphere. The atmospheric pressure at a height of 45 kilometers is supposed to be but a small fraction of 1 millimeter of mercury. On the other hand, the velocity with which the meteors approach the Earth is between 15 and 75 kilometers per second, on the average about 40 kilometers per second, or over 140,000 kilometers per hour. If winds of 150 kilometers per hour velocity were permanently blowing at the height where the meteors become visible, it would not be possible for such winds of rarefied atmosphere to visibly deflect stones falling at the rate of 140,000 kilometers per hour. Approaching the Earth, the meteorites suddenly slow down and turn aside, and some are even repelled into space. A few meteors give the appearance of penetrating into our atmosphere and then leaving it, ricocheting, as it were. 25. The Earth is a huge magnet. It has electric currents in the ground and is enveloped by a number of layers of electrified ionosphere. The Sun possesses an electric charge and magnetic poles. Also, the sunspots are found to be powerful magnets. The ionosphere is permanently charged by particles arriving from the Sun. Sunspots actively influence terrestrial magnetism, ground currents, the ionosphere's charge, and auroras. As the principle of gravitation leaves no room for the participation of other forces in the ordinary movements of the celestial mechanism, these obvious and permanent influences of the electromagnetic state of the Sun on the magnetic field of the Earth, the ionosphere, the auroras, and the Earth's currents are not allowed to have more than zero effect on the astronomical position of the Earth, and this for the sake of maintaining the integrity of the gravitational principle. Well, sure, if you change that, you got to change everything, right? Sun and moon, comets, planets, satellites, and meteorites, all the heavenly host, air and water, mountain massifs, and sea tides, each and all of them disobey the law of laws, which is supposed to know no exception.